Mike Sexton, your host today. I have 41 years experience in admissions and enrollment, the last 11 being at Santa Clara University. I'm currently a senior advisor at My Footpath, and I'm glad to be working with them as they're a leader in the marketing, enrollment, and retention services. Today, we're talking to John Heller, VP for Enrollment Management and New Student Strategies at the University of Miami. John, you must have the longest business card around.
It's too funny. Actually, our chief of staff to the president is actually goes on like 3 lines.
So today we're going to talk about his work. He's been very successful at Miami implementing holistic admission, increasing applications by 60%, and even more importantly, increasing yield by 50%. Before he was at Miami, John was at St. Joseph's University as Associate Provost for Enrollment Management, where he had the highest first-year persistence in history. So he's got a creative history that started long before that with experience at Drexel University, Vanderbilt University, and Denison University. He must be collecting T-shirts. So, John, I was curious when I was at the ACRO Strategic Enrollment Management Conference in Seattle at your session. I'm curious about how you came up with the topic and title of your session, How Organizational Change Influences Market Position Differentiation.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks, Mike, for the opportunity, and it's fun being with you. And I appreciate you sitting on my session. As I said in the presentation, it's a little wonky, but for people like us that have been doing this for a long time, it's incredibly fun and engaging work. I think it's pretty broad based. I mean, truth be told, the conversation or the topic came from my time when I worked at St. Joseph's University. And when I worked at the institution, people used to say all the time, we used to be just like Villanova. I wonder what happened. And so when you in the dissertation or in the EDD space and you're thinking of topics, you're reflecting on some of your experiences in higher education. And it just sounded like a really interesting one that could have some finite work on a quantitative side and a qualitative side to assess and do research on. And so I decided to try to figure it out.
Well, interestingly, with the changes you've made, and lots of have been a lot of places, and have you ever counted up the number of presidents and provosts that you've worked for? I mean, because organizational change is going to start at the top, and whom you report is always going to influence the culture and the structure.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it actually became part of the research. I mean, part of the amazing part about Villanova's story is they've essentially had 3 presidents in 30 years that all were engaged in strategic planning that subsequently built on the strategic plan of the prior president. So it just continued to spiral in a really positive way. Whereas when I worked at St. Joseph's, we went through 3 presidents in 4 years at one point. And I think that employee turnover or that leadership turnover really made it tricky because you stop, start, pause, turn, go sideways, start again. And the story at Villanova was one that was very different.
You refer to transformational organizational change as a major influence to market position. Give us some definitions here.
Sure. So if I think about institutions that have gone through transformational change, or places like Villanova or University of Maryland, Baltimore County, or Elon or Georgia State, High Point, all just some examples. You know, what I found is outside of just the research I did for my dissertation, they all went through very similar practices and processes that helped them get to where they wanted to be from a market position or a transformation perspective. And there are external factors that influence that, but the ones that each institution could control more were internal factors. Things like having consistent leadership or having influential leaders, developing a consistent strategic plan for where they wanted to achieve. And then I think the piece that intersects with that most importantly is engaging the community and getting the entire community aligned with the plan. So everyone was rowing in the same direction to achieve what the leadership or what the institution's ultimately wanted to achieve. It wasn't just one person, it was everybody mobilized, working to accomplish a similar set of objectives.
And even when we get that rare time when everybody's rowing in the same direction, you mentioned there's still external factors. What would be some of those things that you can't really control?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think one of the tricky parts is demographic, and we hear about this and we read about it, is demographic shifts or the demographic cliff. I have two colleagues that actually wrote an article as well recently on demand cliff. So just outside of demographics, student demand for students that are actually interested in the institution. I do think intercollegiate athletics at some institutions play a role. You think about economics. If you go back, Mike, to our time in 2008, socioeconomics and economics in our institutions were meaningful. Politics, I think about some of the political landscape today. Some people would say the Supreme Court decision on race conscious admission is not political. I would say it's incredibly political. I think natural disasters, you think about how Katrina impacted institutions in New Orleans, and then even the healthcare environment. If you think about something like COVID-19, it impacted every institution. So those are some of the external environment or exogenous factors that we can influence to some degree as institutions, but some of those are harder than others. And it's more, how do we do planning to respond to those so we don't feel like we're chicken little, the sky is falling in, and we're just reacting.
Like not having a FAFSA.
Exactly right. Yes.
So,
I mean, we're doing wagers in our office of when it will go live, and my time is 11:59 p.m. on December 31st.
right. I find that at universities, what gets measured gets done. So what are the metrics that you looked at as indicators of change of position?
That's a great question. So, I mean, when I started doing the research, I was lucky enough to have a foundation for some of that work was done by a mentor of mine, David Kalsbeek, and then a good colleague, Brian Zucker. And both had developed a rubric that they used to track market position of institutions, but they didn't do it longitudinally over time. And I thought for the work that I was doing, I thought looking at organizational change longitudinally would be something that would be interesting. So I used their rubric as a foundation, and then I made edits to it. And then I looked at other types of data that I thought could add to it. And so the four major elements that I tried to explore were student persistence, which involved graduation rates, as well as first-year persistence, student demand, which are application numbers, selectivity, yield, academic profile tied to standardized test scores or class rank. I tried to look at faculty characteristics, which I thought were something that were really fascinating. That tied to faculty compensation, student faculty ratio, percent full-time, percent with terminal degree, and then financial resources, like endowment per full-time enrolled student and instructional expenditures per full-time enrolled student. Now, what I found is some of those were really, really interesting, but the longitudinal data that just did not exist for the time that I was working to do the study just was not there. So if I tried to think about 6-year graduation rates, that didn't go back as far as I wanted to. I couldn't get any faculty characteristics that had any longevity in terms of overall the time that some of that information was tracked. And I went back as early as the early 1990s. So to get that was really, really hard. So I had to adapt what was the rubric that was defined by Brian and David to one that I thought had more, was more robust longitudinally. So I adapted what they did to a different measure so I could get a real robust data set.
Yeah, your presentation had great Venn diagrams and line graphs, which we couldn't talk about and have everybody understand. But what was the overlap where you finally found a set that would be comparable? How far back did you end up going?
Yeah, I was able to go back to the early 1990s with the longitudinal data that I have. And your great question or your good point about intersections, I found through my work that intersecting ideas were something that were really meaningful. I mean, none of the influences of organizational change happen in a box, happen in a silo. They all happen. The work of influential leaders and they're working to develop a strategic plan as an intersection. How that intersects with institutional, community, and cultural change, all of that was intersecting. And then, back to our earlier point about how internal environment changes intersect with external environment changes, there's an intersection there that also then intersects with the broad organizational changes of how that influences market position. So the crazy Venn diagram I came up with had lots of intersecting circles because all of that influenced each other in leading to what market position changes would be. And I was lucky enough to read a book called The Medici Effect. And the author said something like intersecting discoveries and conclusions can be found at intersections. And I found that to be very true in the work that I did.
I'm quite familiar with the St. Joseph's Villanova comparison. I started my admissions career in Pennsylvania, and being a basketball fan, was very cognizant of the Big Five going on for basketball in Philadelphia. I understand you mentioned athletics, how that was also an impactful decision, transformational decision for one and not the other.
Yep, that's a great point. So if I think about some of the activity at St. Joseph's, St. Joseph's at one point in time reached the Sweet 16 of the NCAA tournament and had a incredible Cinderella season. And coming out of that, one of the questions said, okay, what do we do now? And the approach the institution took was, we've arrived, we've done it, we're good. We don't have to double down or invest in this any more than we've done now. And then they had an opportunity to join the Big East Conference when it was first formed, and they decided not to. On the other end, at Villanova, they won the NCAA tournament in 1985, and they decided to double down on intercollegiate athletics, join the Big East. And so the institutional decisions that were made by each institution were very different that I think influenced their longer-term trajectories.
So tell me about some of the metrics that you looked at and how they diverged from that point, that particular decision point.
Sure. So when I started doing the work, the 5-year graduation rates of the institutions were somewhat similar. They were like 7 percentage points apart. And then over time, they've diverged to the point where now they're 13 percentage points apart. Overall, one of the rubrics I looked at was reject rate percentile. Rather than admit rate, I looked at reject rate because the higher the reject rate, the scope or the longitudinal directory would increase. And so that was a much more appropriate measure for the rubric I put together. And at one point, the reject rate at each institution was very similar. And in fact, at St. Joseph's, it was higher than it was at Villanova. At this point, Villanova admits about 50% of their students, even less, and St. Joseph's was in the 75 to 80% range. So that's meaningfully diverged over time. Overall endowment per full-time enrolled student at one point was very similar, and now the endowment per FTE at Villanova is over 13 times greater than it was at St. Joseph's. So from a financial resource perspective, from a persistence perspective, from an academic demand, an enrollment demand perspective, all those metrics just change meaningfully over time.
Well, having been to St. Joseph's when you hosted the Jesuit enrollment group, I know you're at that time considering accumulating more land, right?
Yep.
And you did it one way, Villanova did it another way.
Yeah, and I would say that's a great point. So what was one of the phenomena that was occurring in Philadelphia is each institution historically had relied on the Catholic school, high school market to attract student demand for their universities. And each institution recognized that the Catholic school post-secondary or secondary market was starting to dry up. And what St. Joseph's did was they essentially said, no, we're good. We're going to rely on part-time enrollment and graduate enrollment and just stay pat with what we have. Whereas Villanova said, no, we're going to transform our campus and start building residence halls and start recruiting nationally. And so while St. Joseph's has grown their campus and built more residence halls, it was probably about 15, 20 years after Villanova did that work. Right. So Villanova entered that space much earlier than St. Joseph's. And so that influenced as well their market position trajectory earlier in the time because they foresaw this and responded to it by recruiting nationally and then investing in their infrastructure on campus.
Well, having spent the last 30 years on the West Coast, I can tell you that Villanova certainly is a known entity as opposed to St. Joseph's. Even though I worked at a Jesuit school, St. Joseph's is probably one of the lesser known amongst my colleagues. So it worked.
Yeah, I mean, I would, and again, it's kind of a confluence of factors, right? If someone said, "Well, what's the one thing that did?" I would struggle with it because it's not one thing. It's a series of intentional engagements and activities that involve the community internally, and then how they responded and to an external market changes that influence their trajectory over time.
Yeah. Well, you were at an interesting point in history and survived, which is good, and moved on to something even better, bigger and better. But before we leave, do you have any takeaways? Because any admission professional, enrollment professional, or enrollment allies that are watching this say, okay, what can I do with this? What are the nuggets?
Yeah, that's a great point. And one of the topics that when I talked about this at the presentation is one of the cool things is I think the study that I engage in is replicable. Like another institution that said, okay, we would like to track our market position longitudinally. They can use the rubric that I put together and track their own progression over time. And they could say, well, we should also look at what we wanted our institution relative to a competitor. So you could be Pitt and you could say, I want to be what is Temple like today? Two urban institutions within Pennsylvania that are similar size. They could see what their trajectory is like. You could be liberal arts institutions. I mean, when I worked at Denison, we always used to talk about what Kenyon was doing, right? So you could take both the institutions and say, what are those metrics change? How are those metrics changing over time? So if institutions are interested in tracking their own market positions longitudinally relative to a competitor, they could replicate that study. From an enrollment professional's perspective, what I would say is, if you're saying, okay, what can I be doing to influence our market position? First, it's what am I doing to build or leverage our current value proposition to be one that's authentic, coherent, and resonating to ensures that we continue to attract student demand. That's one piece. I would also say is to the degree that you leverage diverse revenue streams of enrollment, you don't want to say we're overly dependent on one revenue stream, because knowing how demographics are changing and demand is changing, I want to make sure that I'm diversifying how I'm doing work so I have flexibility within the work that I'm doing. I want to make sure that I have clarity of priorities from senior administration on what the enrollment team is tasked to do, so you don't feel like you're chasing a squirrel every cycle or within a cycle. Mm-hmm. And then I would just say even broader than that is you're trying to ensure that you have a seat at the strategic planning table. So much of us in the enrollment profession are saying we can influence and impact and affect institutional outcomes, but we have to really know where we're going, how we're going to get there, and the why behind it, because then we can play a more integral role in helping the institution get there. So to me, those are the takeaways from the study.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's the kind of thing where with the demographic cliff and COVID, post-COVID, as I do informal mentoring of some colleagues in the field, it's like, be where you want to be in the next year or two, because it's not going to be pretty. And every week we read another college's retrenching and laying off faculty and eliminating programs, or in fact closing. There was another one this week. That's going to be part of our reality going forward. So I think that study of the competition is critical, but I think it's also important that you don't check into the aspirant school. It's real competition. I mean, use National Clearinghouse data. Don't use the faculty's perception that Santa Clara should be compared to Stanford, or you should just measure yourself against Penn when you're at, St. Joe's. It's like, no, those are apples and oranges. In fact,
yeah, I think that's a really great point. And I try to draw the distinction on my campus that there's a difference between peers and aspirants.
Right.
Like you're sometimes people use the term peer aspirant. I'm saying there's no such thing as a peer aspirant. You're a peer or you're an aspirant, and you have competitors, institutions that you compete against that aren't like you at all. And I think being really clear about who those institutions are gives you a sense of, okay, if we want to be more like an institution, well, do we have the financial resources to compete in that space? Do we have the student demand? Do we have persistence metrics that say, okay, from an outcomes perspective, we are similar to them? Or no, their resources per full-time enrolled student are so exponentially different than ours, there's no way we could ever try to compete. And it's just, there's a level setting that your point is really well taken, that you need to do with your senior administration so you don't feel like you're trying to roll a boulder uphill.
Right. Well, and any of us who's lasted this long in the business, you must have done that well. And I think part of our job is to manage up, which is the 14 presidents and provosts that I worked with. I mean, we're educators and we have to teach them. And for the most part, they know very little about enrollment. So to the degree that you can use kid gloves and get them to realize, no, we can't have all of it. What are the priorities? I can work on 3 of these things, not all of them. So,
yeah, I mean, your point is so well taken. Getting clarity of priorities so they're not conflicting priorities and they are aligned with where the institution wants to go. You couldn't have said it better. And Mike, like you said, you were in the business for longer than I am, so your ability to achieve those outcomes is something that I've tried to do. I think I have days where I do great, and I have days where I just epic fail.
Well, hopefully more of one than the other. Well, thank you, John, for your time. I think there's some great takeaways for everyone. And by the way, if you want to keep up with John, he does a monthly blog on higher education and athletics. As you can tell, we are both former athletes. And no, you can't tell? Anyway, at johnhaller.org if you want to follow along. And I thank you for tuning in.